My name is Helen Richardson. I am 68 years old, and for the last 40 of those years, I was a wife and a homemaker in Savannah, Georgia. My entire world was the house Richard and I built, a quiet life measured in seasons and family holidays. After he died, the silence became the loudest thing in the house. The mornings were the hardest. I would still wake up at 6, go to the kitchen, and start the coffee maker. But I would stop myself just before measuring out the second scoop of grounds. It was a small, stupid habit, but breaking it felt like admitting he was truly gone. The emptiness of his chair at the breakfast table was a physical presence, a hole in the fabric of my reality that I couldn't ignore or patch over. My identity was tied to him, woven so tightly that I wasn't sure where Helen began and Mrs. Richard Richardson ended. For decades, my purpose was clear: manage the home, support his career, raise our children. It was a role I took on without question. Now, with the children grown and Richard gone, I felt like a book with the last chapter ripped out. I would walk from room to room, touching the furniture he'd chosen, straightening pictures of a life that suddenly felt like it belonged to someone else. The person in those photos, smiling next to her husband, was a stranger to me now. I didn't know what she was supposed to do next, or even who she was without him by her side. In the first few weeks, the sympathy was a constant, almost suffocating presence. Neighbors brought by casseroles and baked hams, their faces a mixture of pity and discomfort. Friends from the golf club called, their voices hushed, offering condolences that all started to sound the same. They would say, "If you need anything, Helen, just call." But I never did. What could I possibly ask for? They couldn't fill the silence or answer the questions that were beginning to form in the back of my mind. Their kindness felt like an obligation, a temporary bandage on a wound they couldn't see. And slowly, as expected, the food stopped coming, and the phone calls grew less frequent. The loneliness settled in not like a fog, but like a heavy blanket. It was a tangible thing, pressing down on me in the quiet afternoons. My children, David and Sarah, lived in different states with their own families and demanding jobs. They would call, of course, their conversations filled with rushed updates about their kids and their work. They'd ask, "How are you holding up, Mom?" And I would always say, "I'm doing okay." It was easier than explaining the profound sense of dislocation I felt. They needed to believe I was strong, the unshakable matriarch they had always known. So I played the part, ending each call with a cheerful lie that left me feeling more isolated than before. The nights were a different kind of trial. During the day, I could keep busy with meaningless tasks, dusting shelves that were already clean, weeding a garden that was perfectly manicured. But when the sun went down, the house transformed. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of leaves against the window pane, sounded amplified and threatening. I would lie in our bed, on my side, leaving Richard's side untouched as if he might still return to it. Sleep offered little escape, often bringing dreams where he was alive and well, only for me to wake up to the cold, hard reality of the empty space beside me. A deep, primal fear of being alone in this large, cavernous house began to take root. This fear was soon joined by a creeping, insidious doubt. I found myself replaying our entire life together, searching for clues I might have missed. Was he happy? Did I do enough for him? Was I a good wife? A good partner? The memories that had once been my greatest comfort now felt like evidence in a trial where I was both the defendant and the judge. I would remember a dismissive comment he made years ago, or a business trip that seemed to last a little too long. These were thoughts I had never allowed myself to have before, and their arrival felt like a betrayal of his memory. Yet I couldn't push them away. The feeling of failure was constant and crushing. My entire adult life had been dedicated to one project, our family. And now, it felt like the project had been liquidated. The home was no longer a bustling center of life. It was a quiet, sterile museum of the past. I had no career to fall back on, no independent identity outside of my role as a wife. Richard had handled all the finances, all the major decisions. He used to say he was protecting me from the stress of it all, but now, His protection felt like a cage I hadn't realized I was in. I was 68 years old and felt utterly unprepared to navigate the world on my own. I tried to establish new routines to fill the gaping hours in each day. I joined a book club, but found I couldn't concentrate on the pages. The words would blur together, my mind drifting back to the past. I spent more time in the garden, pulling weeds with a vengeance, but every flower, every shrub, was something Richard and I had planted together. There was no escaping him. His presence lingered in every corner, in the scent of his aftershave still faint on the collar of his favorite jacket hanging in the closet. The grief wasn't a passing storm. It was the new climate I was forced to live in, and it was slowly eroding my will to even try. More than anything, I felt invisible. When I went to the grocery store, people I had known for years would offer a tight, sad smile and hurry past, unsure of what to say. I was no longer part of a couple. I was a widow, a social loose end. At a neighborhood gathering, I stood alone in a corner, watching couples laugh and talk. It was as if I was behind a pane of glass, watching a life I could no longer participate in. The world kept spinning, people kept living, but my own life had ground to a halt. I was a ghost in my own town, a relic of a marriage that was now just a collection of memories and fading photographs. Then the practical realities began to intrude on my grief. The first stack of mail arrived addressed solely to me, Ms. Helen Richardson. It was a small change, but it felt like a demotion. Inside were the mortgage statement, the insurance premiums, the utility bills. I spread them out on the dining room table and stared at them for a long time. These were tasks Richard had always performed from his home office, a space I rarely entered. The numbers swam before my eyes, a language I didn't speak. A cold knot of panic tightened in my stomach. I was responsible for all of this now, and I had no idea where to even begin. A week later, a thick envelope arrived from Richard's bank. The letter inside was dense with formal, impersonal language. It spoke of his estate, of the probate process, of assets that needed to be accounted for, and debts that needed to be settled. It requested a copy of his will and other essential documents. The words were a blur of legal jargon that made me feel small and ignorant. I realized with a sickening jolt that I didn't know where Richard kept the most important papers. He had a filing cabinet in his office, but it was always locked. My ignorance was no longer a shield. It was a liability. My son, David, called that evening. His tone was brisk, practical. "Mom, have you started going through Dad's office yet? We need to get the ball rolling on the estate. The bank will start freezing accounts if we don't get them the paperwork." I could hear the impatience in his voice, the frustration of a busy man trying to manage a problem from 1,000 miles away. I wanted to scream that I couldn't face it, that the thought of sorting through the remnants of my husband's life was more than I could bear. Instead, I just said, "I'll get to it this weekend, dear." The lie tasted like ash in my mouth. The pressure wasn't just coming from my family. A neighbor, Carol, whose husband had passed away 2 years prior, stopped by one afternoon. She stood in my foyer, her eyes scanning the grand staircase and the high ceilings. "This is a lot of house for one person, Helen," she said, her voice laced with a knowing pity. "I sold our place within 6 months. It was the best decision I ever made. You have to be practical about these things." Her unsolicited advice felt like a command, another voice telling me that the life I had known was over and it was time to dismantle it, piece by piece. Finally, I forced myself to confront Richard's office. The room was at the back of the house, and it felt like his territory, not mine. It smelled of old paper and the faint scent of the cigars he occasionally smoked. The large mahogany desk was neat, but piles of folders and journals were stacked on the credenza behind it. The main filing cabinet stood against the wall, a silent, metal sentinel guarding his secrets. I tried the handle, but it was locked, just as I knew it would be. Standing there, I felt like a stranger who had broken into a private space, a trespasser in my own home. After searching for an hour, I found a small ring of spare keys in a ceramic bowl in the kitchen junk drawer. My hand was unsteady as I returned to the office and tried one key after another. The third one clicked. The lock sprang open with a sound that seemed to echo in the silent house. I pulled open the top drawer and was met with a dense wall of manila folders, each one neatly labeled in Richard's precise handwriting. The labels were a mystery to me. Syndicate holdings, offshore investments, private equity. It was a map of a world I had never been invited into. I spent the next 3 days sitting on the floor of that office, surrounded by paper. I pulled out files, trying to make sense of the complex web of Richard's financial life. There were statements from banks I'd never heard of, deeds for properties I didn't know we owned, and records of transactions that were completely foreign to me. I discovered small, regular cash withdrawals, made over many years, that didn't correspond to any household expense I could recall. Each document I read only deepened my confusion and made me feel more alienated from the man I thought I knew so well. The confusion slowly began to curdle into a vague but persistent suspicion. It was a cold, unpleasant feeling that I tried to push away. Richard had always been a private man, especially about his business dealings. He would pat my hand and say, "Don't you worry your pretty little head about it." At the time, I had accepted it as his way of caring for me. But now, sitting amidst this mountain of secrets, it felt different. It felt like he had deliberately built a wall around a huge part of his life, a wall designed to keep me out. The thought was disloyal, but it was also undeniable. I felt completely and utterly adrift. I didn't know who to trust. Calling a lawyer felt like a monumental step, an admission that I was in over my head. It also felt like a betrayal, as if I were inviting a stranger to pick apart the life Richard and I had built. The shame was a physical weight, making it hard to breathe. How could I have been married to a man for 40 years and know so little about our shared existence? The question echoed in my mind. A relentless accusation of my own inadequacy and blindness. My daughter, Sarah, called while I was sitting in the middle of the paper-strewn floor. I could hear the forced cheerfulness in her voice as she asked how I was doing. "You have to be strong, Mom," she said, repeating the familiar refrain. "Dad wouldn't want to see you falling apart." Her words, meant to be comforting, felt like a slap. Strong. I had never felt weaker or more fragile in my entire life. I was a 68-year-old woman who had just discovered she was a stranger to her own husband and a novice in her own life. Strength felt like an impossible demand. The letters from the bank became more frequent, their tone shifting from polite inquiry to firm insistence. They needed a definitive copy of the will for the probate court. I had found one, dated 15 years ago, but it felt incomplete. It referenced business assets that seemed to have been sold and partners who had since passed away. I had a gnawing feeling that there was a more recent version, a piece of the puzzle I was missing. The pressure was mounting from all sides, and I felt myself starting to shut down, overwhelmed by the sheer scale of my own ignorance. The house itself began to feel like a trap. The beautiful rooms, once filled with light and laughter, now seemed to hold their breath, heavy with unspoken secrets. The portraits of Richard on the mantelpiece seemed to watch me with an expression I could no longer read. Was it love? Or was it deception? I started closing the curtains during the day, unable to bear the cheerful sunlight streaming in. The walls I had so lovingly decorated now felt like they were closing in on me, a gilded cage built from a lifetime of carefully constructed lies. I stopped answering the phone when it rang, letting the calls go to the answering machine. The voices of concerned friends and impatient family members would fill the silent house, but I couldn't bring myself to respond. The pile of unopened mail on the hall table grew taller each day. Facing the outside world, facing the future, required a strength I simply did not possess. All I wanted was to retreat, to curl up and disappear into the past, back to a time when my life felt simple and my marriage felt real. But there was no going back. My self-imposed isolation became absolute. The world outside my front door ceased to exist. The friends who had promised to be there for me had moved on with their lives, assuming I was coping in my own way. My children were busy, their calls becoming less about my well-being and more about the practicalities of the estate. I was completely alone, Marooned in my grief and wrestling with a growing dread that the life I had cherished was built on a foundation of sand. The silence in the house was no longer just an absence of sound. It was a presence, heavy with the weight of everything I didn't know. Then, one Thursday afternoon, as I sat motionless in the living room, the silence was shattered by the sharp, jarring sound of the doorbell. It wasn't the gentle chime of a neighbor or a delivery person. It was a long, insistent press, followed by another. The sound cut through my stupor, and a wave of pure ice washed over me. I had a sudden, unshakable certainty that the person on the other side of that door was not a friend. It was the future, arriving uninvited. I felt cornered, my heart pounding against my ribs. I was trapped in my beautiful, silent house, with absolutely nowhere left to hide. I walked to the door, my hand hesitating over the brass knob. The bell rang again, a sharp, impatient sound that made me flinch. It wasn't a sound I associated with this house, with this life. I took a breath and opened it. A woman stood on my porch, her face unfamiliar but her expression one of unnerving confidence. She was perhaps in her late 50s, dressed in a way that was both expensive and severe. Beside her stood a young man, his eyes fixed on the ground. He looked to be in his late 20s, his posture rigid and uncomfortable, as if he had been forced to be here against his will. "Are you Helen Richardson?" the woman asked. Her voice was level, without warmth. It wasn't a question so much as a confirmation. I nodded, my throat too tight to form words. I clutched the collar of my robe, suddenly feeling exposed and unprepared. I should have asked who they were, what they wanted, but I was frozen by their presence. They were strangers, yet they stood on my porch as if they had a right to be there, as if my home was already a place they knew. The silence stretched, filled only by the distant hum of a lawnmower down the street. "We need to come in," she stated, not waiting for an invitation. She stepped past me into the foyer, the young man following a half step behind. The scent of her perfume, strong and floral, filled the air, an unwelcome invasion of the quiet, familiar scent of my home. She looked around the grand hall, her eyes sweeping over the staircase and the family portraits on the wall. Her gaze was not admiring. It was assessing, like someone taking inventory of property. The young man, Leo, she called him, still refused to meet my eyes, his discomfort a palpable force in the room. I closed the door slowly, the heavy click of the latch sounding final, like a cell door locking. My heart was pounding a frantic, unsteady rhythm against my ribs. I followed them into the living room, the room where Richard and I had spent so many quiet evenings. She had already seated herself in his favorite armchair, a violation so profound it took my breath away. Leo remained standing by the fireplace, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. I stood in the doorway, a stranger in my own space, waiting for an explanation that I was beginning to dread with every fiber of my being. "My name is Martha," the woman said, finally breaking the silence. "And this is Leo. He is Richard's son." The words hung in the air, thick and impossible. I must have misheard. Richard had 2 children, David and Sarah. I knew them. I raised them. I looked at the young man, searching his face for any resemblance, any trace of the husband I had known for 40 years. There was something in the line of his jaw, a subtle echo of Richard in his youth, that made a cold dread begin to pool in the pit of my stomach. This was not a mistake. Martha reached into her handbag and pulled out a folded document. She placed it on the coffee table between us. "This is his birth certificate," she said, her voice devoid of any emotion. "Richard Richardson is listed as the father. He was born 28 years ago." I stared at the paper, the official lettering a blur. It was a fact, presented as clinically as a medical diagnosis. A 28-year-old son. That meant her relationship with my husband had not been a brief affair. It had been a life running parallel to my own for nearly 3 decades. She then produced a photograph from the same bag. It was worn at the edges, the colors slightly faded. In it, a younger Richard was holding a baby. He was smiling, a wide, genuine smile I recognized instantly. He was looking down at the child with an expression of pure, unadulterated love. Beside him stood Martha, her hand resting on his arm, looking at the camera with a triumphant glow. They looked like a family, a happy family. The image was a dagger, twisting in a wound I hadn't even known I had. It was undeniable proof of a world I never knew existed. "Richard loved me for 30 years, Martha said, her voice softening with a cruel, feigned pity as she watched my face crumble. He provided for us. He was a father to Leo. This house, his assets, they are as much our legacy as they are yours." She leaned forward, her eyes locking onto mine, and delivered the final fatal blow. "He told me everything. You were the wife, the facade, the respectable life he needed to maintain his position. You were just the first." The words didn't just hurt, they erased me. 40 years of my life, invalidated in a single sentence. I don't remember them leaving. The next thing I knew, I was standing alone in the silent living room. The photograph and the copy of the birth certificate were still on the coffee table, two pieces of paper that had detonated my entire reality. The world had gone quiet and small, reduced to the space between me and those objects. I felt nothing and everything all at once. The grief I had been drowning in for Richard was gone, replaced by a vast, hollow emptiness. The man I was mourning had never truly existed. He was a character, and I had been his longest-running co-star. For days, I moved through the house like a ghost. The memories that had once been my comfort were now tainted, each one a potential lie. I looked at our wedding photo on the mantelpiece and saw not a promise, but the beginning of a long deception. Every business trip he took, every late night at the office, was now suspect. The foundation of my life had been revealed to be sand, and it was all washing away, leaving me with nothing to stand on. The humiliation was a physical presence, a constant companion that sat with me at the empty dining table and lay beside me in the cold, empty bed. The shock slowly gave way to a cold, quiet anger. It wasn't a fiery, screaming rage. It was a deep, chilling fury that settled in my bones. It was an anger directed not just at Richard, but at myself. How could I have been so blind? The signs must have been there. Small clues I had chosen to ignore or explain away. His privacy about finances. The separate bank accounts he said were for his business. The detached way he sometimes spoke of our future. I had mistaken his secrecy for protection, his distance for preoccupation. I had been a fool. This new awareness was a harsh, blinding light. It illuminated every corner of my past, revealing the cracks I had never allowed myself to see. I had built my identity around being his wife, his partner. Now, that identity was gone. I was not the respected widow of a successful man. I was the first wife, the convenient facade. The knowledge was a poison, seeping into every memory, turning everything sour. I realized I had not been a partner in a marriage. I had been an employee in a long-term contract, and my services were no longer required. I started to resist this new reality. For a few days, I tried to deny it. To convince myself that Martha was a liar, a grifter trying to take advantage of a grieving widow, I would push the birth certificate and the photograph into a drawer, trying to will them out of existence. But the image of Richard's smile as he held that child was burned into my mind. The truth was relentless. It didn't matter if I locked it away. It was already inside me, dismantling me from within. There was no going back to the person I was before they came to my door. The loneliness I had felt after Richard's death was nothing compared to this. This was an isolation so profound it felt like I was the only person left on Earth. Who could I tell? My children. How could I explain to them that the father they idolized had lived a lie? That they had a brother they never knew about? The shame was suffocating. It was my failure as much as it was his betrayal. I had failed to see the truth of my own life. The thought of their pity was more than I could bear. So I said nothing, the secret festering inside me. I began to see the house not as a home, but as a cage. A beautifully decorated, expensive cage that Richard had built to keep me in. Every object, every piece of furniture, felt like a prop on a stage set. I had spent 4 decades tending to this museum of a lie, polishing the silver and arranging the flowers, all while the real story was happening somewhere else. The weight of it all was crushing me. I stopped eating. I stopped sleeping. I would just sit in the living room, staring at the armchair where Martha had sat, feeling the last of my strength drain away. Then, another thick envelope arrived from the bank. It was a final notice, the language firm and impersonal. They needed the will to proceed with probate, and if I did not produce it, they would be forced to freeze all assets. The letter was a jolt of cold water. While I was paralyzed by the past, the future was moving on without me, threatening to leave me with nothing. The practical realities of my situation could no longer be ignored. My grief, my humiliation, none of it mattered to the bank. They just wanted the paperwork. That letter was the spark. It broke through the fog of my despair. The thought of Martha and her son inheriting any part of this life, any part of the world I had helped build, was intolerable. My quiet, cold anger began to solidify into something else. Resolve. I would not let them win. I would not let Richard's final act be the destruction of my life. I had to fight back, but I didn't know how. I was still the woman who didn't know where the important papers were kept. My ignorance was my greatest enemy. That night, I went into his office. It was the first time I had entered the room since the day I found the locked filing cabinet. This time, I didn't feel like a trespasser. I felt like an investigator at a crime scene. I wasn't there to mourn him. I was there to uncover the full extent of his deception. I took the small ring of keys from the kitchen drawer and unlocked the cabinet. The drawers slid open with a smooth, metallic sound. I was no longer afraid of what I might find. I needed to know everything. I spent hours on the floor, surrounded by a mountain of paper. I went through every file, every statement, every legal document. I was looking for a more recent will, something that might mention Martha or Leo. I found records of payments, school fees, and trust funds set up under their names. The evidence of his double life was meticulous, organized, and damning. Each piece of paper was another small betrayal, another confirmation of the lie I had been living. But there was no new will. The only one I could find was the old one, from 15 years ago. I was about to give up, overwhelmed by the sheer volume of his secrecy, when my hand brushed against a large manila folder at the very back of the bottom drawer. It was thicker than the others, and it wasn't labeled with the same precise handwriting. The label was just a single word, written in my own cursive, household. I didn't remember labeling it. I pulled it out, my curiosity piqued. It was full of old receipts, appliance warranties, and contractor invoices, the mundane paperwork of running a home. I started to put it aside, dismissing it as irrelevant. But something made me pause. Tucked between an old warranty for a refrigerator and the blueprints for the patio, there was a different kind of document. It was a single page, folded in 3-dar, with a notarized seal at the bottom. The legal language was dense, but a few words stood out to me, words that made my breath catch in my throat. I unfolded the paper carefully, my hands trembling slightly. The title at the top was clear and unambiguous, Quitclaim Deed. I read it once, then twice, the meaning of the words slowly sinking in. Years ago, during a business venture that had gone sour, Richard had been worried about creditors. To protect our home, our main asset, he had signed it over to me. He had told me it was just a formality, a temporary measure for legal protection. I had signed where he told me to sign, asked no questions, and then promptly forgotten all about it. He had given me a piece of paper to sign, and in his arrogance, he had never bothered to reverse it. He had never imagined a future where I would be the one in control. In that moment, holding that single piece of paper, the power dynamic of my entire life shifted. Richard had built a fortress of secrets to keep me out, but in his attempt to protect his assets from the outside world, he had inadvertently handed me the key to the entire kingdom. He had thought he was protecting his legacy, his money, his 2 separate lives, but with one signature, given in a moment of his own fear, he had made me the sole, undisputed owner of the very ground on which his lies were built. The house was mine. A strange sense of calm washed over me. It wasn't triumph, not yet. It was clarity. For the first time in months, I knew exactly what I had to do. The path forward was no longer shrouded in a fog of grief and confusion. The shame and helplessness that had paralyzed me began to recede, replaced by a quiet, steely determination. I was no longer a victim of his story. I was the one who would get to write the final chapter. My humiliation was not the end. It was the beginning. I stood up, the quitclaim deed clutched in my hand. I walked out of his office, leaving the piles of his secret life scattered on the floor. I didn't look back. I went to the kitchen and found the phone book, my movements calm and deliberate. I looked up the number for a real estate lawyer, one of the best in Savannah. My finger traced the name on the page. I picked up the receiver, the plastic cool against my skin. The silence of the house was no longer oppressive. It was waiting. It felt like the entire world was holding its breath, waiting to see what I would do next. I took a deep breath, the first truly steady breath I had taken in weeks. I was not the woman Richard had left behind. I was not the naive wife Martha had so easily dismissed. I was Helen Richardson, and I was about to dismantle my husband's legacy, piece by piece. I dialed the number, and as the phone began to ring, I knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The phone call was short. I gave my name and the reason for my call. The lawyer on the other end, a Mr. Davies, was all business. He scheduled an appointment for the following afternoon. I wrote down the time and address on a notepad by the phone. After I hung up, I stood in the kitchen for a long time. The silence felt different now. It was no longer an absence of Richard. It was the presence of my own thoughts. The first step had been taken. The fear was still there, a low hum beneath the surface, but it was no longer in control of my hands or my voice. I had a purpose. The next day, I dressed carefully, not in one of the floral dresses Richard liked, but in a simple pair of gray slacks and a white blouse. It was the kind of outfit I wore to parent-teacher conferences years ago. Practical, serious. I gathered the papers I thought were important: the old will, the bank letters, and the quitclaim deed. I placed them in a large envelope. Driving to the lawyer's office, I kept my eyes fixed on the road. I refused to let my mind wander to the past, to the 40 years I had driven these same streets as a different person. Today, I was just a woman with a legal problem, nothing more. Mr. Davies' office was on the top floor of a modern glass building downtown. It felt a world away from my quiet, traditional neighborhood. His office was sparse, with a large desk and 2 chairs facing it. He didn't offer condolences or ask about my well-being. He simply said, "Please, have a seat. Show me what you have." I slid the envelope across the polished desk. He pulled out the documents, his face unreadable as he examined each one. He spent the longest time on the quitclaim deed, reading it twice. The silence in his office was heavy, filled with the weight of legal language I barely understood. He looked up at me over his glasses. "Mrs. Richardson, this deed is ironclad. The house is yours, solely. It is not part of the probate estate." The words were simple, but they landed with the force of a physical blow. It was real. I had the power. He then explained the next steps, the legal notices, the filings. My mind struggled to keep up. He used terms like executor, beneficiary, and contesting a will. I felt a familiar wave of ignorance wash over me. I had forgotten to bring the property tax statements he needed. I felt foolish, unprepared. My brief moment of control evaporated, leaving the old, helpless Helen in its place. I drove home feeling defeated. The single piece of paper in my purse was a key, but I didn't know how to use the lock. That evening, I went back into Richard's office. This time, I wasn't searching for secrets. I was searching for tools. I found the tax records, the insurance policies, the original mortgage documents. I spent the entire night sorting them into neat piles on the floor. I labeled each pile with a sticky note. It was a small, methodical task, but it was mine. For the first time, I wasn't just living in the house, I was managing it. I was learning its language, the language of numbers and obligations Richard had always spoken for me. A new routine began to form. Every morning, I would wake up, make a single cup of coffee, and go into the office. I didn't turn on the television or listen to the radio. I worked. I created a ledger, writing down every bill, every account number, every password I could find. It was slow, tedious work. Some days, the sheer volume of what I didn't know was overwhelming. I made mistakes. I called the wrong utility company. I misread a statement and panicked, thinking we were broke. But each mistake was a lesson. Each small problem I solved on my own was a victory. The office was no longer his space. It was becoming my command center. I started answering the phone again. When my son, David, called, his voice was laced with impatience. "Mom, the bank called me again. They said you haven't submitted the will. What is going on?" I didn't offer excuses or apologies. I simply said, "I have retained a lawyer, David. He is handling it." There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line. I had never spoken to him like that before. My voice was calm, firm, and offered no room for argument. He didn't know what to say. The conversation ended quickly after that. I hung up the phone, not with guilt, but with a strange sense of clarity. The dynamic had shifted, but the nights were still difficult. The old thoughts would creep back in the darkness. I would lie in bed and see Richard's face. I would remember a kind gesture, a shared laugh, and the anger would soften into a familiar, aching grief. Was I being cruel? Was I erasing the good parts of our life out of spite? One night, I took our wedding album down from the shelf. I opened it, and there we were, young and smiling. The woman in the picture had trusted him completely. I felt a surge of pity for her. I closed the album and put it in a box in the back of the closet. I couldn't be her anymore. To survive, I had to let her go. The fear of failure was a constant companion. What if Martha's lawyers were better than mine? What if there was some other document, some other secret I hadn't found, that would take everything away from me? I would wake up with my heart pounding, convinced I had made a terrible mistake. I was a 68-year-old homemaker going up against a 30-year deception. The odds felt impossible. In those moments of doubt, I would go into the office, even in the middle of the night, and turn on the desk lamp. I would look at the neat piles of paperwork, at the evidence of the work I had done. It was proof that I was capable. It was my anchor. One afternoon, I was in the garden pulling weeds when my neighbor Carol stopped by the fence. "I heard from my son-in-law at the bank that there are some issues with Richard's estate," she said, her voice dripping with concern that felt more like curiosity. "I hope everything is all right. It's so difficult to handle these things alone." Her words were a reminder of how people saw me, a fragile, incompetent widow. I stood up and brushed the dirt from my hands. "Thank you for your concern, Carol," I said, my tone polite but firm. "Everything is under control." I turned back to my garden, leaving her standing at the fence. I would not be the subject of neighborhood gossip. A letter arrived from a law firm I didn't recognize. It was from Martha's attorney. It was a formal inquiry, a polite but clear threat. It mentioned Leo's rights as a biological heir and suggested we could settle this matter amicably to avoid a lengthy court battle. My hands trembled as I read it. They were coming for their share. The old Helen would have been terrified, would have called her son in a panic. I folded the letter, placed it in a fresh envelope, and wrote Mr. Davies' address on the front. I dropped it in the mail without a second thought. It was his problem now, not mine. I was learning to delegate. I was learning to trust my own decisions. The biggest challenge came from my daughter, Sarah. She called, crying. "Mom, David told me you hired a lawyer. He said you sounded cold. What's happening? Why are you shutting us out? We're your family. We just want to help you." Her words were a dagger of guilt. She was right. I had shut them out. But how could I explain the truth? How could I tell her that the family she knew was a lie? I couldn't. So I said the only thing I could. "I'm not shutting you out, dear. I'm just handling things in my own way. Please trust me." It felt inadequate, But it was all I had to give. The secret was a wall between us, and I was the one who had built it. Mr. Davies called me a week later. "They want to see the will," he said. "They are preparing to contest it on the grounds of Leo's exclusion." I felt a knot of ice in my stomach. It was happening. "What do we do?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "We have two options," he explained calmly. "We can fight them in probate, which will be long and public, or we can make the will irrelevant." I didn't understand. "How?" I asked. "The house. Mrs. Richardson," he said. "You own it. You can sell it. You can do whatever you want with it. The proceeds would not be part of the estate." The idea was radical, terrifying, and liberating all at once. Sell the house. This house was my entire life. Every room held a memory. Richard and I had chosen the wallpaper in the dining room together. We had planted the oak tree in the front yard when David was born. Leaving it felt like another death, a final amputation of my past. I spent the next 2 days just walking from room to room, touching the furniture, looking out the windows. I was saying goodbye. It was the hardest thing I had ever had to do. But with each step, the house felt less like a home and more like a museum of a life that was no longer mine. On the 3rd day, I made the call. I found the number for the top real estate agent in Savannah. Her name was Susan, and she arrived the next morning. She was energetic and professional, walking through the house with a critical eye. She talked about staging, curb appeal, and market value. She saw the house not as a collection of memories, but as a product. Her detachment was exactly what I needed. She didn't see the ghost of Richard in his favorite armchair. She just saw a room with good natural light. With her there, I could finally see it that way too. The for sale box sign was hammered into the front lawn on a Tuesday morning. The sound of the mallet striking the post was loud and final. I watched from the living room window. It was a public declaration. Helen Richardson was moving on. I knew the calls would start. From my children, from my friends, from the neighbors. I was prepared for their questions, their shock, their disapproval. But I didn't feel fear. I felt a quiet, unshakable resolve. This was my decision, born not of grief or anger, but of a clear-eyed understanding of my new reality. The first open house was a surreal experience. Strangers walked through my home, opening my closets, commenting on the kitchen countertops. They spoke of knocking down walls, of painting over the colors I had so carefully chosen. They were planning a future in the space that held my entire past. I stayed in the garden, out of sight. I listened to their voices, and instead of feeling violated, I felt a sense of release. The house was already letting me go. It was preparing for a new life, and so was I. My confidence grew with each step of the process. I reviewed offers with Susan, discussing the financial merits of each one. I signed documents with a steady hand. I was no longer the woman who was afraid of paperwork. I understood the terms. I asked intelligent questions. I negotiated. I was an active participant in the dismantling of my old life and the construction of my new one. The woman who couldn't find the tax records a few weeks ago seemed like a distant stranger. The house sold quickly. The final closing date was set. The weeks leading up to it were a blur of activity. I hired movers. I began the enormous task of sorting through 40 years of possessions. Each object forced a decision. Keep, donate, discard. It was a brutal but necessary process. I kept the photos of my children, a few pieces of jewelry, and my grandmother's china. The rest of it, Richard's clothes, his books, his awards, I packed into boxes for donation. I was curating my future, choosing only the things that belonged to me. The day before the movers came, David and Sarah arrived. They stood in the half-empty living room, their faces a mixture of confusion and hurt. "Mom, why didn't you tell us?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "We could have helped you." I looked at my 2 children, adults with their own lives, and I saw how much they still didn't know. "There are some things a person has to do alone," I told them. It wasn't the whole truth, but it was the only truth I could give them. They wouldn't understand the betrayal, but perhaps they could understand my need for independence. On the final day, I walked through the empty house one last time. The rooms echoed with my footsteps. The walls were bare, marked with the faint outlines of where pictures used to hang. It looked like a crime scene, the evidence of a life hastily removed. But it didn't feel sad. It felt clean. It was a blank slate. I was no longer haunted by the memories that lived here, because the house itself was now just a shell. I had taken everything that truly mattered with me. I met Mr. Davies to sign the final papers. The check from the sale was handed to me. The amount was staggering. It was a lifetime of work, of shared investment, converted into a single piece of paper with my name on it. Mr. Davies then showed me the incorporation documents he had prepared. The Sinclair Foundation, I read aloud. Sinclair, my maiden name, a name I hadn't used in almost 50 years. It felt strange and wonderful on my tongue. It was the name of the woman I was before I became Mrs. Richard Richardson. As I drove away from the lawyer's office, I passed the turnoff to my old street. I didn't even glance down it. I kept driving toward the city, toward the small, modern apartment I had rented. It was a place with no history, no ghosts, just a view of the sky and a future that was entirely unwritten. I thought about Martha and Leo, about their lawyers receiving the news that the main asset of the estate no longer existed. I felt no triumph, no desire for revenge. I simply felt quiet. I parked my car and walked into my new building. The lobby was bright and clean. As I rode the elevator up to my floor, I caught my reflection in the mirrored walls. The woman looking back at me was older, her face etched with lines of grief and stress. But her eyes were clear. They were not the eyes of the lost, confused widow who had opened her door to a stranger weeks ago. They were the eyes of a woman who knew her own mind, a woman who had walked through fire and come out the other side. Standing in my new, empty apartment, with the city lights twinkling below, I realized the transformation was complete. It had happened so gradually I hadn't even noticed. It wasn't one single moment of decision, but 1,000 small choices. The choice to make a phone call, the choice to sort a pile of papers, the choice to say no, the choice to sell, the choice to let go. I was no longer the woman defined by Richard's life or his lies. I was Helen Sinclair, and for the first time in a very long time, I was free. The first morning in my new apartment felt like waking up in a foreign country. The sounds were different, the light was different, and there were no ghosts in the corners of the rooms. I made a single cup of coffee in a machine I had just bought, and the simplicity of the act felt profound. I was no longer performing a ritual of grief, a sad imitation of a life that was gone. I was just a woman making her breakfast. The check from the sale of the house was in my purse, a tangible weight that felt more like a key than a burden. It was the physical proof that my past was now a closed account, settled in full, and the future was a blank ledger waiting for its first entry. I spent that first week doing nothing remarkable, and it was the most remarkable week of my life. I bought new sheets, a set of plain white dishes, and a comfortable chair to put by the window. Each purchase was a declaration of independence. I wasn't choosing things to complement a life I shared with someone else. I was choosing things for myself, based on my own taste. The woman who had once felt invisible now had a physical space that was entirely her own. The silence was no longer an enemy. It was a companion, a quiet space where I could finally hear my own thoughts without the echo of Richard's expectations or the weight of his secrets. The contrast between my old life and my new one was stark. Before, my days were measured by the upkeep of a large, silent house, a museum of a life that wasn't real. My identity was tied to being Mrs. Richard Richardson, a role I had played for 4 decades. Now I was Helen Sinclair. I woke up each morning with a purpose that came from within, not from a duty to someone else. The transformation was not just about changing my address. It was about reclaiming my name, my time, and my mind. The old Helen was a passenger in her own life. The new Helen was finally in the driver's seat, deciding the destination for the first time. Mr. Davies called a few days after I had settled in. His voice was professionally neutral, but I could detect a hint of satisfaction. "Mrs. Richardson," he began, then corrected himself. Ms. Sinclair, I have an update. I informed Martha's counsel that the property had been sold prior to any formal contest of the will. I also informed them that the proceeds were not part of the estate. He paused. They were, to put it mildly, speechless. Their entire case was built around that house. Without it, their claim is significantly weakened to only other assets, which are now frozen in probate. The news didn't bring me joy, just a quiet sense of finality. It was over. The reaction from my children was more complicated. David called first, his voice a tight coil of confusion and frustration. "Mom, what is going on? Selling the house? A new apartment? We looked online and saw you started some kind of foundation. You're giving Dad's money away." He didn't understand because he couldn't see the whole picture. To him, I was an unpredictable widow acting irrationally. I didn't try to explain the betrayal. I simply said, "David, this is my life now. The decisions I'm making are for me." He didn't know how to respond to that. He was used to the mother who always put the family first, not the woman who was putting herself first. Sarah's call was softer, filled with a hurt I found harder to bear. "Why didn't you talk to me, Mom? I feel like I don't know you anymore." Her words stung because they were true. She didn't know this version of me, because this version had never been allowed to exist before. "I'm sorry if I hurt you, Sarah," I told her, my voice steady. "But I am the same woman who raised you. I'm just finally getting to know her myself." It was the closest I could come to an explanation. I had to protect them from the full truth of their father's life, even if it meant creating a distance between us. My silence was its own kind of protection. My old friends and neighbors were a source of endless gossip. Carol, my former neighbor, called under the pretense of checking in. "Helen, dear, we were all so shocked. Selling the house so fast. Are you sure you're all right? A new foundation? It all seems so drastic." Her concern was a thin veil for her insatiable curiosity. She wanted the story. She wanted to know the details of my supposed breakdown. I gave her nothing. "I'm better than all right, Carol. I'm starting over." Her disappointed silence was more satisfying than any argument would have been. I was no longer a character in their neighborhood drama. I had walked off the stage. The most tangible result of my transformation was the Sinclair Foundation. I met with Mr. Davies and a financial advisor to finalize the structure. I sat at a large boardroom table, a place where I would have felt impossibly small just months ago. Now, I listened intently, asked questions, and made decisions. I was the one in charge. The foundation's mission was simple and direct: to provide financial and legal resources for women over 60 who found themselves suddenly responsible for their own lives. I was building a safety net that I never had. It was not an act of charity. It was an act of solidarity, forged from my own humiliation and pain. The day I signed the final documents to establish the foundation was more significant than my wedding day had been. On that day, 40 years ago, I had given my name and my future to someone else. On this day, I was taking it back and giving it a new purpose. As I signed Helen Sinclair on the dotted line, my hand was perfectly steady. I wasn't just signing a legal document, I was signing my Declaration of Independence. The ink was a permanent mark of my new reality. Richard's legacy was one of secrets and division. Mine would be one of support and empowerment. I was erasing his name from the future and writing my own in its place. The first grant from the foundation went to a woman named Margaret. Her story was painfully familiar. Her husband of 50 years had passed away, leaving behind a mountain of debt she knew nothing about. She was on the verge of losing her home. The foundation provided her with a lawyer and a financial planner. I read her thank you letter in my quiet apartment, and the words blurred. She wrote, "You didn't just save my house. You saved me. You made me feel like I wasn't invisible." In her words, I saw my own reflection. My pain had been transformed into someone else's hope. This was a legacy worth building. Looking back, the woman I was just a few months ago feels like a stranger. She was a person defined by grief, fear, and a profound sense of helplessness. She was trapped in a house of memories that had become a prison. She believed her life was over, That woman would never have been able to pick up the phone and call a lawyer, let alone sell her home and start a new life from scratch. The journey from that version of myself to the person I am today was not a single leap. It was 1,000 small, terrifying steps taken in the dark, each one moving me further away from the past and closer to myself. I realized that Richard's greatest deception was not his other family. It was convincing me that I was incapable of living without him. He had built my cage with his protection, his secrecy, and his quiet dismissal of my own abilities. He had called it love, but it was control. By keeping me ignorant, he kept me dependent. The ultimate irony was that his own actions, the quitclaim deed he signed out of his own fear, were what gave me the key to my own freedom. He had inadvertently armed me with the one weapon that could dismantle the world he had so carefully constructed. He never saw it coming. The anger I had felt was gone. It had been a fire that burned away the fog of my grief, but it was not a sustainable fuel. In its place was a quiet, unshakable sense of self. My worth was not determined by my role as a wife or a mother. It was not tied to a house or a bank account. It was something inherent, something I had forgotten I possessed. I had spent 40 years tending to his life, his home, his legacy. Now, for the first time, I was tending to my own. The work was harder, but the rewards were infinitely greater. The peace I felt was not the absence of conflict. It was the presence of my own strength. My relationship with my children began to heal, slowly. They started to see that my decisions were not born of madness, but of a newfound clarity. David called one day, his tone different. I saw the article in the local paper about the foundation. "Mom," he said, "what you're doing, it's impressive." It wasn't an apology, but it was an acknowledgement. It was a start. He was beginning to see me not just as his grieving mother, but as a woman with her own agency and purpose. He was meeting Helen Sinclair for the first time, and I think he was beginning to respect her. Sarah visited me at my new apartment. She looked around at the simple, modern space, so different from the home she grew up in. "It's so bright in here," she said quietly. We sat by the window, and for the first time, I told her a small part of the truth. I didn't tell her about Leo, but I told her that her father had made financial decisions without my knowledge, decisions that had put my future at risk. She listened, her eyes filled with a new understanding. "I'm proud of you, Mom," she said, taking my hand. In that moment, I knew we would be okay. Our relationship would be different, but it would be built on a more honest foundation. I no longer thought of Martha or Leo. They were ghosts from a life that was not mine. Their quest for a piece of Richard's inheritance was their own story, their own battle to fight. My battle was over. I had not fought them for the money or the house. I had fought for my own dignity, for my right to not be erased. My victory was not in defeating them, but in making them irrelevant to my life. I had walked away from the battlefield, and in doing so, I had won the only war that mattered, the one for my own soul. Their anger and greed could not touch me here, in this new life I had built. Sometimes, I walk through the city, and I feel like a tourist in my own life. I see things with fresh eyes. I notice the architecture of the buildings, the faces of the people passing by. Before, my world was the size of my house and my garden. Now, it is as big as I want it to be. I am no longer defined by the four walls Richard built around me. I am defined by the choices I make every day. The choice to try a new coffee shop, the choice to visit a museum, the choice to help another woman through my foundation. My life is a series of small, deliberate acts of freedom. The greatest conquest was not financial. It was internal. It was the moment I realized that I was not a victim. What happened to me was a profound injustice, a betrayal that shattered my world. But I had refused to let it be the final chapter of my story. I had taken the broken pieces of my life and used them to build something new, something that was entirely my own. The pain was the catalyst, but the strength was mine all along. It had just been dormant, waiting for a reason to awaken. Richard's betrayal was the reason. I learned that a person's legacy is not what they leave behind in a will. It's not the money or the property. It is the impact they have on the world. The the story they choose to write with their life. Richard's story was one of deception, a carefully constructed facade that ultimately crumbled into dust. My story, the one I am writing now, is about resilience. It is about the quiet power of a woman who was underestimated, who was dismissed as just the first, but who found a way to have the final, definitive word. My transformation was not about forgetting the past. It was about refusing to be imprisoned by it. The memories are still there, but they no longer have power over me. They are like photographs in an old album I no longer need to look at. I can acknowledge that the life I had contained moments of happiness, but I now see the full picture. I see the love and the lies, the comfort and the cage, and I have chosen to step out of the frame, to live a life that is not captured in a photograph, but is experienced in each present moment. The respect I gained was not from others, but from myself. The admiration of my children and the surprise of my old friends were secondary. The only person I needed to prove anything to was the woman who stared back at me in the mirror. For years, I had seen a wife, a mother, a homemaker. Now, I see a founder, a survivor, a leader. I see Helen. The journey to find her was long and painful, but I would not trade it for anything. She is the greatest discovery of my life. For anyone watching who feels invisible, who feels their story has been written for them by someone else, know this: the end of one chapter is not the end of the book. You hold the pen. Your past does not have to define your future. The world may try to tell you who you are, to put you in a box, to dismiss your worth. Do not let it. Your strength is not in the noise you make, but in the quiet, deliberate choices you make when no one is watching. It is in the single step you take toward a new life. My message is not one of revenge. It is one of reclamation. Reclaim your name, your voice, your power. It may be buried under years of duty, of sacrifice, of being told you are not enough, but it is there. You do not need to scream to be heard. Sometimes, the most powerful statement you can make is to silently pack a box, sign a paper, and walk away. True justice is not about settling old scores. It's about building a future that the past can no longer touch. I am 68 years old. For many, that is an age of endings, of looking back. For me, it is the age of beginnings. I have a foundation to run, people to help, and a city to explore. I have a life to live on my own terms. The house Richard built is now just a memory, a place where someone else's story is unfolding. My home is no longer a place made of bricks and mortar. It is the peace I have built inside myself. My name is Helen Sinclair. I was once a wife, a role defined by another. Today, I am the author of my own story. The inheritance Richard left was a legacy of lies, a kingdom of secrets meant to be divided among the people he had wronged. But he made one mistake. He forgot who owned the ground it was all built on, and in the end, the final will was mine. My story was not over. It was just beginning.